How many of you made a New Year's resolution this year? Quick show of hands. Really? What? I'm not even going to say there's one down the front. It's the only one. So nobody made a New Year's resolution. That's fantastic. 'Cause that means that I'm not going to be talking to a discouraged bunch of people who have, made a resolution. Oh, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to change that, or whatever, and got to way into the year like now, and have gone, that didn't work, did it? That's what I was assuming you would all be like, but that's okay. Those kind of things we tell ourselves, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to change that, do often lead to that sense of, that took longer than I thought, or that was a lot more work than I thought, or I failed that dismally, even though, I was the one who was supposed to do the changing or the working. In our world, we're often encouraged to think that the focus should be on us, what we need to do or ought to do with our lives and in this world. But here in church, we get to focus not on us, but on God and on what Christ has done and is doing for us. And so in Genesis, we're told, before the light came, there was nothing. Once the light had been separated from the darkness in God's creation, we see that plants are starting to grow, fish begin to come, and animals and a host of living things start moving about, and even humanity. There is a real sense in which, in God's creation, everything that exists only exists as it's seen in the light. Because if there was no light, we wouldn't be able to see all the things that God had created. I wonder if you can experience this, if you can remember a time when you've perhaps driven to or travelled to a destination and you arrived at your hotel, and we had some opportunity to do this in our holidays. You get there at night time. Maybe it's a friend's house you're staying at, and you see the front door because they've got a light on, and you go in. But you haven't seen the house, you haven't really seen anything around you, or the surroundings of that place and what it looks like. And it's not until the dawn and the sun comes up and light grows in the place that you begin to realise, there's grass and there's trees, there's mountains, and you can start to understand what you're surrounded by. Not because it wasn't there last night when you arrived, not because it wasn't beautiful last night when you arrived, but because without the light, you couldn't see it. And you didn't have an understanding of what it really was that was there. So this morning in our Bible passage, we read of Jesus' transfiguration before the disciples, and it's a little bit like that. When we read that he shone, he glowed, light came out of him and through him and from him. For the disciples, for those who were sitting there watching this miraculous thing happen, for them it was a light bulb moment, literally and metaphorically. They didn't just see Jesus as the light, but a light went on in terms of their understanding. A bit like sitting before a dark scenery and the sun begins to rise, and at first they could make out shapes, but then as it gets higher and fuller and the brightness grows, they start to realise more, and they see Jesus more fully than they had done. They realise not just that he is the light, but that the light is coming in him, and that his light is now shining on them. And they hear those words from God, "This is my beloved. Listen to him." And that adds to their understanding. It adds because they know something about Jesus' identity. For so many chapters in Mark's Gospel, we see Jesus' identity is a question mark. It's a bit of a riddle. People are trying to work out who this person is. Now, I mean, we know because we've read the story. That's great. But the story is about people trying to know who Jesus is and where he comes from, what he's about, what his ministry means. And so for the disciples, they see Jesus as the light. They hear this word that he is God's beloved. And they realise not just something about his own identity, but something about themselves. Because now they see we are disciples of God's beloved. And it informs them of who they are in the light of who Jesus is. And so Paul, in his letter to the Corinthian church, he says to them this interesting phrase: "This is why we don't get discouraged." Now, as I'm reading that, as a minister of a congregation, thinking about, who you would write a letter to, beginning with those words, "Now this is why we don't get discouraged." Call me cynical if you like, but I suspect they're discouraged. They're a discouraged congregation. They're a group of people who had these great ideals for whatever reason. They thought it was going to turn out like this, and it hadn't. And they were discouraged. Maybe you know what that's like, being in a church that feels like they're falling down, that they're not going to be there in maybe the short or the near future. I know I've been in churches like that and ministered in churches like that. It can be a fairly discouraging place to be. It's logical, really, when you think about it. We're told to go and make disciples of all nations. Well, we haven't quite managed that yet, and it's been an awfully long time. We haven't really transformed Mandurah, let alone Perth or all of WA. The task we have is massive, and it's beyond us. If we were to think about that, there are all sorts of reasons that we as a congregation might get discouraged. But I'm glad, because that's not you, clearly. Our inability to grow God's kingdom by ourselves and with our own strength can be discouraging. Paul might, however, be writing to individuals in that church, knowing their lives, knowing where they've come from and what they're up against. Maybe he knows that there are some of the leaders there or people in the church that are personally discouraged. And you know what that's like. You do your best, you put in all the hard work from your end, and you don't see the results. You don't get the responses that you thought you should. All your energy and all your plans, all your working doesn't come to fruition, and you join the ranks of those people who at an individual level become discouraged. It didn't turn out the way you hoped or thought it should. But with all the good reasons for being discouraged, Paul says to this congregation, this is why we don't get discouraged. Hopefully our ears prick up at that. What did he say? What comes next? Why don't we get discouraged? Because we don't preach about ourselves. We preach about Jesus Christ as Lord. If all we had to offer was ourselves, if all we had to give into this world for their ailments, their problems, and their difficulties was ourselves, well, it's not very much. If the good news, the gospel, was just us and what we could do or what we could provide, or the healing that we might be able to give, it would be cause for discouragement, because it's not going to go far. If it's just you, or if it's just me, or just this congregation, it doesn't go far in this world and won't change much. But Paul says our hope and our source of encouragement is Jesus Christ as Lord. He is the same God who said, "Let the light shine in the darkness." The same God who created everything. That God is our hope and our source of strength, our source of the light. The light was never you. The light was always that God at work, still creating. The God who could create all that you see, all that you know, out of nothing. That God is the one who's still active and working in your life. If he could create everything from nothing, what can't he do? What can't he achieve in you or in this community? So Paul is going back to that and reminding his congregation of that very thing. He says the light was never in you or you itself. The light is Jesus. And he's the same God who created all light and brought everything into being. That is our source of hope. He is our source of light and of goodness, of strength and of healing, and all those things, they come from that God. And it's good to remember, it's good to remind ourselves that we are not the sole responsibility of our relationship with God. We don't make it, we don't create it, we don't build it. God does that in us. Just like I was trying to explain to the children, we don't have the light in ourselves necessarily. We reflect God's light. We are much more like the moon. It's just because we are where we are and we are the way God made us that we reflect his glory. We reflect what God has to offer this world. And he is the God who can create everything from nothing. That is our source of hope. That's why we don't get discouraged, even in the face of plenty of good reasons to. Because God's light shines in us. He's the one who can transform our lives. Just as he transformed the lives of all of those disciples who were his first followers. Any light you have to share is reflected light. And later on, Paul would go to use that wonderful image that we are jars of clay, but inside us is this treasure, this wonderful, amazing treasure. And in a sense, we are this rudimentary clay pot. So that everybody would know it's not because of us that the goodness of God is the way it is. It's got nothing to do with us. But the treasure is in God. The light that we have is reflected light. And it comes from Christ. It comes from God Almighty. That's what we have to share this world. That's what we have to share with people who have long-term illness or brokenness in their lives, dependence and family trauma, all sorts of things. We have a treasure and a light to offer. It's not us though. It's Christ. He is that source. Thanks be to God.